this opportunity to come and speak to you. If you'd like to turn to John, to the Gospel of John, chapter 13. What I'm going to be looking at this morning, what I'm going to be bringing is, we'll be looking at chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians. But we continue in 1 Corinthians this morning. Of course, that is known as the chapter of love. And as we prepare to consider that, I'd like to read from John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. We have Jesus here speaking. A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another, as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another. As we look at chapter 13 in 1 Corinthians, speaking of love, talk about the word there just a little bit. Of course, we know there's some different Greek words that are translated as love. The ones that are used so much in the New Testament are phileo and agape. And I'm not going to really look at the differences in these words, just to be aware that there are those. And reading about them, studying about them, there's a lot of conflicting information and sometimes oversimplification of the differences in the meaning of those words. But the word here in chapter 13 of Corinthians, and the word that we just read that Jesus spoke, the word there for love, is agape. And we don't need to really look at definitions of agape because this chapter will explain to us what that word means. And as we look at this, I'm using the King James Version, and King James uses the word charity here rather than the word love. But it is the same. It's the same word, agape, the same word that Jesus used in the verse we just read. It's something I've tried to study and look at that. Why there is this difference in King James? Why there's charity in some places and love in others? And I hadn't been able to figure it out. It is kind of interesting. It's interesting trying to understand it. If you go back to the Latin Vulgate, it will translate the word agape. It will translate it sometimes as caritas and sometimes as dilectio. And then John Wycliffe, when he translated the Bible into English in the late 1300s, he was translating from the Latin. He wasn't translating from the original languages, so he was going directly from the Latin. And he used, when he translated that word dilectio, he translated that as love. And caritas, he translated as charity. And our word charity goes back to that Latin word caritas. But then English versions from Tyndale, like in 1525, from Tyndale up to the King James Version in 1611, they rendered agape sometimes as love and sometimes as charity. But they didn't follow the same way that the Latin had done it. So I don't really understand the purpose of it, but that's just, I am going to be reading from the King James, and it does use charity. It's the same word. And if anybody knows why that is, I'd love to know. The word love is used more in translating agape than charity is. Okay, before we go into chapter 13, I'd like to look at chapter 12 a little bit for the context of it. As we looked at in the class, the book of 1 Corinthians is dealing with some of the problems that they had in Corinth and some of the questions that they had for Paul. So Paul is dealing with some of their problems, and chapter 13 is written addressing those problems. So the immediate chapter here, chapter 12, he's talking about the spiritual gifts and the difficulties that they were having with using these spiritual gifts, these miraculous gifts that they had a lot of trouble with. So if you have your Bible open looking at chapter 12, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll just kind of touch on what's being communicated in some of these verses. In verse 1, it starts out now concerning spiritual gifts. So that's the subject of 12, 13, and a lot of 14, is the concerning the spiritual gifts, how they're using them, how they're misusing them, how they're misunderstanding their importance. And so in verse 4, he speaks of there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. So all these different gifts are from the same Spirit. Verse 7, the manifestation of the Spirit is given to every man to profit withal. So these gifts that they have these different gifts. They're all given by the same Spirit. They're given by the Holy Spirit. And the purpose of that, each man has a different gift. Each person has a different gift to profit everyone. So different people have different gifts, but it's all for the profit of the body. And then he goes through some of these different gifts. In verse 8, one has a word of wisdom, to another a word of knowledge. And 9, to another faith, to another healing. And verse 10, to another working of miracles, to another discerning spirits, to other kinds of tongues, to another interpretation of tongues. But again, verse 11, all one in the selfsame Spirit. Then skipping down to, going through from 12 to 27, the idea of that one body that has many members. And of course, we can apply that. All of this we can apply to ourselves. They're talking about spiritual gifts, miraculous things that they have. We all have different abilities and different roles, but it's all one body. There's one body with many members. Verse 28, there's different positions and different gifts in the church. God has set the members, every one of them in the body, as it pleased him. And then as we get to the end of this chapter, verse 31, back up to 29 here. Well, I'll go all the way back to 28 because this is important here. And God hath set some in the church, first apostles, secondarily prophets, thirdly teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healings, helps, governments, diversities of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Are all workers of miracles? Have all the gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet I show unto you a more excellent way. So that more excellent way is what chapter 13 is. And as we looked at just a little bit in the Bible class, in the first few chapters of 1 Corinthians, he's dealing with division. He's dealing with the divisions in the church because they're separating into parties. Somebody saying, I'm following Paul, another, I'm following Apollos, etc. And the answer to that division was not to think or not to go beyond what is written, to follow the instructions, to make everything according to the pattern. We see that in verse 6 of chapter 4. And these things, brethren, I have in a figure transferred to myself and to Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think of men above that which is written, and that no one of you be puffed up for one against another. So that's the solution to the division. Here we have in chapter 13, in chapter 12, they have this division over these, or this problem over these different gifts, thinking that one gift is better than another. And here is the more excellent way. This is another solution to division and problems in the church. First, to follow the pattern, and the second is love. This chapter is so beautiful, I'd like to just read it without breaking it up, first of all. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass, or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child, I thought as a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. So let's go through and look at some of these. Verse 1 addresses tongues here right away. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels. He's dealt with this, these gifts. He speaks of the greatest possible manifestation of this gift, that you had the ability, you could speak in the tongues of everything that you could imagine. All the tongues of men, all the tongues of angels. Without love, it's just noise. So there's nothing to it. And this is a gift that they were very impressed with the gift of speaking in tongues. And they were having problems with using it, as we see in chapter 14. They were ranking these gifts. It's interesting here, when Paul gives a list here of what he's set in the church, and he starts out, first of all apostles, secondarily prophets, he puts tongues in the last in that list. And it's something that they were pretty impressed with. And here, it's first in this list as being worthless without love. In verse 2, the next one is prophecy. And this is the gift that he encourages. If you're going to look for a gift, prophecy was the one that they should be looking for. In chapter 14, you can see that in verse 13, and then 39. The reason it was the best one is it was the one that was most useful to edify the church at that time. Without having the written scriptures, being able to speak God's message miraculously was what built up the church the most. It was the most valuable one. But so first of all, he speaks of the gift that they were so impressed with. Next, he speaks of the one that is more valuable, and going on with the ones that are valuable, which would fit in here in verse 8 of chapter 12, the word of wisdom and the word of knowledge. So the idea that if you had the gift of prophecy, and you had the gift of understanding and the gift of knowledge, and all faith, so that you could move mountains. And we see that in Matthew chapter 17, verse 20, where Jesus speaks of just having a little bit of faith, you would be able to move mountains. So all these things are the more important and strong things, but still, without love, if you have all those things, you're nothing. So just stressing these things, both the less important and the more important, being nothing without love. If we go back in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Not every one that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works. And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. So here you have something similar to the same idea. They're people doing these great works, but outside of God's will, and it's worthless. And speaking of the good works, in verse 3, he gets into the good works. If you give everything to feed the poor, give your body to be burned without love, it's nothing. And going back to Matthew chapter 6, you see some other examples of that sort of idea. Chapter 6, verse 1, take heed that ye do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have the glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. And then to Matthew 23. And verse 23. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. So these weightier things. And of course here, love being the greatest. And then verses 4 through 7. You see the characteristics of love. What this love is. It suffers long, or is long-suffering. It's patient. It's kind. It is not envious. It vaunteth not itself, or is not boastful. Is not puffed up. And all these characteristics of love, he's speaking to the problems that they had in Corinth, and the problems that they had with the use of their spiritual gifts. He uses at the end that love is not puffed up. You find in the New Testament 7 times where that term's used, puffed up, and 6 of them appear here in 1 Corinthians. The only other one is in Colossians. So he speaks of them being puffed up throughout the book, and here we see that love is not puffed up. Verse 5, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil. The only other place that phrase, behaving unseemly, is found is in chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, where it speaks of a man, if he thinks he is behaving unseemly toward his virgin. So that's the only other place that is used. That thinking no evil. Now that idea of thinking no evil, it reckons or counts or imputes no evil. The American Standard Version says, taketh not account of evil, and the New American Standard does not take into account the wrong suffered. So it's not the idea of thinking about evil, it's the idea of it doesn't count that or impute it to someone else. And verse 6, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth. And you see a problem in 1 Corinthians there in chapter 5, and it wasn't necessarily rejoicing, but it's another puffed up. They were puffed up concerning their tolerance of iniquity. And there in chapter 5, verse 1, they were tolerating things that they should not. And love does not rejoice in evil. The love that's being described here is what is actively seeking what is best for someone. And actually, I should go back to 5 and read that. I was going to skip reading it. 5 verses 1 and 2. It is reported commonly that there is fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife. And ye are puffed up, and have not rather mourned, that he that hath done this deed might be taken away from you. So he speaks then of how that should be dealt with, and how that should be done. And that, in considering that in love, that the love here that's described, actively seeking the good, seeking what is best for someone, practicing it may not always feel good, both for the one that's loving or for the one being loved. And in this case, it was doing something that was hard and unpleasant for the sake of that person's good, for the sake of bringing them back to the truth, and also for keeping the church pure. We see a few other examples of that to go to Proverbs chapter 13. In verse 24, he that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. And then, related to that, Hebrews chapter 12. In verse 6, for whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. So that idea of love, doing what seeks the best, even when it's difficult. Verse 7, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. This shows the perfection and the completeness of love. It's not that love is gullible. It's that love does not come short in any of these areas. And verse 8, charity never faileth. Whether they be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. And it doesn't mean, now here when it speaks of failing, it doesn't mean to go wrong or to mess up. But it just means that it comes to an end or becomes useless. So failing here just means to come to its end. And you contrast here these gifts, these important gifts that were given by God, and that they will come to an end, contrasting with love, that love will never end. When it says, love never faileth, love never runs out, love will go on. It is, love is a more excellent way than even the best of the spiritual gifts. Of course, that is the context. He's showing them the more excellent way than the ways that they were seeking. One reason, and that's what's seen here, one reason that it is the more excellent way is that those gifts were temporary, and love is not. Okay, verse 9, the knowledge and the prophecy is in part, coming from that which is partial, not complete. The revelation is not complete. They're getting it in these pieces through this prophecy. But something is coming. In verse 10, something is coming. It's in the future for them that is perfect or complete, and that will replace what's partial or incomplete. And then we see in verse 11 the idea of being a child versus being an adult. You have, when manhood comes, the childish things end. And that's a picture of what happens there with the church. The church was in its childhood, was in its infancy, and it needed these spiritual gifts to be established. But when it became a man, when it came into its adulthood, then those childish things passed away. In verse 12, another picture of that, looking into the word here, glass, looking at glass darkly, the idea is a mirror. And think of a mirror that's of polished metal in low light. So you're looking at a glass darkly, but think of it as polished metal in low light and compared to face. That idea of the knowledge here that they have that comes from something partial compared to the knowledge that is of the same kind that I'm known by. And so these contrasts here, partial versus complete, childhood versus manhood, and through a glass darkly as compared to face. The idea of that partial, which was represented by the spiritual gifts, and then the complete, what was coming to them, which I understand to be God's complete revelation. They had that, their knowledge of the new covenant was obtained through miraculous revelation to various individuals. It was confirmed as being true by miracles. Paul said that would end, and we can see that it has. we now know about the new covenant through the New Testament scriptures. So we are the same church as them, but a different place and time. We have the scriptures and the ability to do miracles has ended. And then verse 13. Now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. That word abide, that idea is to continue, to go on, to dwell, endure, or remain. So it's contrasted again to the spiritual gifts. Those will pass away, but these three will they remain then, and they will remain. So let's take just quickly, as we're coming to a close here, let's take a look at those three. Faith. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11, of course. Hebrews chapter 11, we'll just look at the first few verses. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good report. Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it, he being dead yet speaketh. And then on to verse 6. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And let's look at hope in Romans chapter 8. The most specific verse 24 of chapter 8, but let's go back to 18. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. And not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. For we are saved by hope. The hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for? But if we hope for that we see not, then do we with patience wait for us. Likewise the Spirit also helpeth our infirmities. For we know not what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit itself maketh intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. And he that searcheth the hearts knoweth what is the mind of the Spirit, because he maketh intercession for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called, and whom he called, them he also justified, and whom he justified, them he also glorified. But verse 24, what is seen is not hope. So we look at these three, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest is love. Faith and hope only exist when the object is not seen, and nothing is hidden from God. God sees everything. God doesn't have faith, and God doesn't have hope, but God is love. Let's look at 1 John chapter 4. Starting in verse 7. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. And every one that loveth is born of God, and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. And in closing, keeping in 1 Corinthians. I'd like to read from chapter 15. I'll read the first few verses of chapter 15 by way of invitation. And after this, we'll stand and sing the song that's been selected. Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel which I preached unto you, which also ye have received, and wherein ye stand, by which also ye are saved, if ye keep in memory what I preached unto you, unless ye have believed in vain. For I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures,